Okay, so welcome everybody. And I just want to say a few kind of summary comments about chapter 4 before we move on to chapter 5. As I mentioned last week, we saw that there are some key scriptures, key verses that I think tell us a great deal about, what chapter 3 and 4 is all about. In chapter 3, verse 7, we have God saying to Joshua, "This day, for the first time, I will exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they shall know that I will be with you as I was with Moses." And then in chapter 4, verse 14, we see that actually coming through. Here we go. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, so that they revered him all his days as they had revered Moses. So, here's the promise, here's the fulfillment. And of course, it's extremely important in the continuation of Joshua's leadership that he be seen to be the proper heir of Moses, and that they listen to him in the way that they listened to Moses. But the purpose of this whole exercise is not to create this godlike figure of Joshua, absolutely not. The purpose we see in chapter 4, verses 21 through 24. And here we see he charged this is Joshua speaking. He charged the children of Israel as follows: "In time to come, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones?" Referring, of course, to those 12 stones that he takes out and he puts them in the Gilgal. "Tell your children, here the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you crossed, just as the Lord your God did to the Sea of Reeds," or the Red Sea, "which he dried up before us until we crossed. Thus all the peoples of the earth shall know how mighty is the hand of the Lord, and you shall fear the Lord your God always." So what we see here, first of all, is a very interesting pulling together, not just this story about the crossing of the Jordan, but pulling it together with what we've seen until now. So first of all, we see that like Rahab in chapter 2, we have here a mention of the parting of the Red Sea. But this connects it. In other words, in the same way that Rahab expresses the wonder and the awe of the nations of her area, the nations of Canaan, at God and at Israel because of the parting of the Red Sea, here we have this additional element. Now, because the Jordan too was parted in the same miraculous way by God for the people of Israel, now we're going to have all the nations of the earth recognizing God's strength, God's power, etc., as a result of both of these activities, both of these miracles, also the parting of the Red Sea and also the parting of the Jordan. So that kind of pulls that together. And of course, we have here ultimately, what is the goal? Again, we said Joshua is going to be the proper heir of Moses, but to what ultimate end? And we have that in verse 24. "So that all the peoples of the world will recognize, will see how mighty is the hand of the Lord." Okay, so that relates more to, this idea of the miracles, etc. Although Joshua will be viewed by the nation as the leader and as the one who has been instrumental in all of this. But more important here is the last part of verse 24. "And you shall fear the Lord your God always." And here then really is the point. Joshua needs to be established as the leader of the nation so that as a result of his leadership, the nation itself will fear the Lord your God always. Okay, and so this really is ultimately the plan. God's name will be glorified, both so that the nation of Israel will see that, and so all the nations will appreciate that. Now, the first verse of chapter 5, actually, if you ask me, should be the last verse of chapter 4, because it really is much more connected with that. The first verse of chapter 5 kind of now we have what is the purpose listed for us in chapter 24 about all the nations of the world will recognize God. And now we have a kind of establishment of this, that it has happened, it is coming true, when all the kings of the Amorites on the western side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaanites near the sea heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the sake of the Israelites until they crossed over, they lost heart, and no spirit was left in them because of the Israelites. And this really should be, if you ask me, the fitting end of chapter 4, not the beginning of chapter 5. We see what happens with the parting of the Jordan. God is now telling us through Joshua. Joshua tells them, based upon the word he has from God, about how monumental this whole thing is, and the fact that as a result the nations of the world will recognize God. Well, here it's happening. This is really the conclusion of that story. Now, beginning with verse 2 in chapter 5, we're starting a brand new story, and basically they're in the land. They crossed the Jordan. They're in the land of Israel. They're actually settled in the Gilgal, which is where they put up that monument. They're going to be in the Gilgal, and it is from the Gilgal that they will go to carry on whatever battles they're going to carry on to capture the land. But right now they're kind of in a resting mode. And let's read verses 2 through 12, because this is its story in its own right, and it's one very much worth discussing. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and proceed with the second circumcision of the Israelites." So Joshua had flint knives made, and the Israelites were circumcised at Givat Ha'aralot. Now, the actual name of the place, Givat, is a hill, and Aralot is the foreskin. So basically, it's the name of a place that's called the Mountain of the Foreskins, of course, named for the circumcision ceremony. This is the reason why Joshua had the circumcision performed. All the people who had come out of Egypt, all the males of military age, had died during the desert wanderings after leaving Egypt. Now, whereas all the people who came out of Egypt had been circumcised, none of the people born after the Exodus during the desert wanderings had been circumcised. For the Israelites had traveled in the wilderness 40 years until the entire nation, the men of military age who had left Egypt, had perished, because they had not obeyed the Lord. And the Lord had sworn never to let them see the land that the Lord had sworn to their fathers to assign to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. But he had raised up their sons in their stead, and it was these that Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, not having been circumcised on the way. After the circumcising of the whole nation was completed, they remained where they were in the camp until they recovered. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." So that place was called Gilgal, as it still is. Now, the word Gilgal in Hebrew comes from the word legolel, to roll. Okay, so that gives an understanding of why it's called Gilgal. Okay. Last week I mentioned briefly that there's an archaeologist who did all kinds of uncoveries and came up with the idea that Gilgal is actually a place of worship, and that there were a number of them, and they were all called Gilgal, and he related it to this footprint, is this place where you see stones set aside in the shape of a footprint. But here the Bible itself tells us it has to do with rolling away the disgrace of Egypt, which I would assume is referring to the actual circumcision. Encamped at Gilgal in the steps of Jericho, the Israelites offered the Passover sacrifice on the 14th day of the month toward evening. On the day after the Passover offering, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the country, unleavened bread and parched grain. On that same day, when they ate of the produce of the land, the manna ceased. The Israelites got no more manna. That year they ate of the yield of the land of Canaan. Okay, so we have a story here. First of all, the primary part of the story at the beginning is the circumcision. And we learn that throughout the 40 years of wandering in Egypt, they had not circumcised their babies. It was considered too dangerous as they're wandering in the desert. The conditions were such that they were not circumcising, and therefore all this younger generation that's coming into the land have not been circumcised, and they need to be circumcised. So that's the first order of business. And right after that, we see they're going to celebrate Passover, and then immediately following the Passover, the manna ceases, and for the first time, they eat bread that is from the produce of the land of Israel. Okay, so first of all, I want to discuss a little bit about the circumcision, and then we want to see how these three events, circumcision, Passover, and the stopping of the manna, how these three things are actually connected in a very intimate way. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about circumcision. And in order to understand circumcision, I want to go back and see the history of circumcision. Where do we learn about it in the Bible, and in what context? So, of course, the first time we learn about the circumcision is with Abraham. And circumcision is called a brit milah. Brit is a covenant. It is a covenant of circumcision. It's not just a medical procedure, but it is about a covenant. And I'm reading now from Genesis 17. Abraham is 99 years old, okay? And God has already said to him, I will place this covenant between you and me, and I will multiply you greatly. And that's in verse 2. Now in verse 10, this is my covenant, which you will keep between me and you, between your children and with your children after you. Every male will be circumcised, and you will circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that will be a sign of the covenant between us. At 8 days, a boy of 8 days will be circumcised throughout the generations. So here we have very definitely the actual physical circumcision becomes a sign of a covenant between God and the Jewish people, between God and Abraham and his children. Now, is it all his children? We know later on in this chapter that indeed Abraham not only circumcises himself, but he circumcises all of his servants. He circumcises his son Ishmael. So we may think that all these people are part of the covenant, but here God makes it very clear, because at the same time, God promises Abraham that he will have another son, that Sarah will actually have her own son. And Abraham says in verse 18, it's good enough that I have Ishmael. As long as Ishmael remains alive, it's good enough. And God says to him in verse 19, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. You will call his name Isaac, and I will keep my covenant with him, an everlasting covenant for his children ever after. So here it makes it very clear that, and we'll see that later also when we talk about the Passover, there are people who are circumcising because they are part of the household of someone of Israel. But indeed, it is not Ishmael who will continue this actual covenant. The covenant of the circumcision, the covenant that talks about the special relationship between God and the children of Israel, will only be carried through Abraham and then through Isaac. So that is how we are first introduced to circumcision as a covenant between God and the nation of Israel. Our next introduction to circumcision is with Moses. Okay, and this is actually part of a very strange story, and I'm not going to totally, go through the whole story. It's very complicated. It's a study in and of itself, but just to refer to it as relevant to us. Then Exodus chapter 4, let's start with verse 22. Just to set this, Moses is on his way back to Egypt. He's already encountered God at the burning bush. He has gone back. He has, he has 2 sons now, and time has come. God says, okay, he's sitting there long enough in Midian, get up and go. This is the time. Okay. And God says to him in verse 22, he's telling them, what are you going to say to Pharaoh? You shall say to Pharaoh, so says the Lord, my firstborn son Israel. And I will say to you, send out my son so that he will serve me, which is, of course, this first, instruction to Pharaoh. And then just after that, so we get the message from God, and then we find out that on his way, he stops at an inn. And while he's at this inn, an angel or some messenger of God or somehow encounters him and wants to kill Moses. Why? Another time. But this is what's going on. What is the solution to this threat to Moses' life? Zipporah, verse 28, Zipporah takes a flint and she cuts off the foreskin of her son and she touches his feet, okay, or she puts it at his feet, Moses' feet, and he says, "You are a groom of blood to me," okay? And then the angel leaves him alone. Again, what's the meaning of this? The deeper meaning, it's a very difficult section. We're not going to go into this now. But what we do see very clearly is that there is a problem in that Moses' son, and it's arguably the second son, because there's a son who's born just before this. The second son, Eliezer, I think, is the second one. And arguably, he was just born. They didn't yet circumcise him. And therefore, they're on their way to Egypt with this uncircumcised son. And this cannot be. So we have clearly something set out here. Moses is on his way to begin the process of redemption of the Jewish people. Must make sure that everybody is properly circumcised in that family. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem. Okay? 1 second. Okay, so that we see that already there's this relationship between the need for circumcision. And another thing that I think is very significant here, that it's here that God first says about the nation of Israel, my firstborn son. And I would suggest that when you say my firstborn son, it's never in the Bible, firstborn son is never the firstborn. We know that Isaac is chosen as if he's the firstborn to inherit the promises. Ishmael is really the firstborn. Okay, Jacob becomes the inheritor of the promise. It's Esau who's the firstborn son, and it's actually Esau who sells the firstborn right to Jacob. And we can go on. Reuben is the firstborn son of Jacob, but no, it's Judah who has more of the leadership of the nation, and to some extent Joseph, but certainly not Reuben. So firstborn is never in the Bible a question of who came first, but a question of who was chosen. And in fact, the word for Bachor and Nivchar is very similar. It's a difference between a Kaf and a Chet, two different Hebrew letters, but that have the exact same sound. Okay, so it's just an interesting thing. I do believe here, when we're talking about the firstborn, the first nation is Israel. The nation of Israel is like God's firstborn son. At the same point, we're seeing the importance of circumcision. I think is definitely clearly a message that the two go together. Okay, the responsibility of this chosen nation is to be loyal to the covenant with God, and that is symbolized by this symbol as was set forth to Abraham in the circumcision. Okay, now we also have I'm going in order chronologically in the Bible, so the issues that are going to crop up when we're going to go back to Joshua and have a better understanding of Joshua as we review all of these things. Okay, so if we go back, now we're in the book of Exodus, we're still in the book of Exodus, and we see in Exodus 12, we begin the commandments having to do with the Passover sacrifice. And there's actually different kinds of commandments here. There's commandments that refer only to the actual Passover sacrifice that they will have in Egypt the night before they leave. Okay, but there's also mention of the traditions of the Passover sacrifice that will carry on for generations. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is there's blood. Okay, the Passover sacrifice is blood, and it's not just as you sacrifice any animal, there's blood, but here we're in Exodus 12, verse 7, you should take from the blood from the Passover sacrifice, and you should put it on the two, on the lintel and the two doorposts and on the houses. And of course, this will become a sign afterwards, so that when the angel of death comes along and kills the firstborn, he will pass over the houses where that has this blood. Okay, so the blood, and we see here further in Exodus 12, verse 13, and the blood will be for you as a sign on the houses. The same sign, the same word, sign, as we learned that the circumcision becomes a sign, okay, of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. Now, this idea of the blood and the sign, okay, of the Passover, the blood being the sign. Now, a circumcision also involves some blood, but we never have any idea of this blood. But I just would mention briefly something that is in Jewish tradition. That's an interesting interpretation in the book of Ezekiel. Okay, there's a chapter, a very interesting chapter, chapter 16 in the book of Ezekiel, that talks about, in a kind of allegoric way, talks about God's discovering or birthing forth the nation of Israel. And it's, Israel is compared to a foundling, okay, like an abandoned child, and God wipes off her blood and like kind of brings her to her. And it's a very interesting chapter. But there's a verse, it says, chapter 6, and I pass over you and I see you dwelling in your blood, and I will say, through your blood is life, and I will say to you, through your blood is life. Okay, now this particular verse is something that is in the Passover Haggadah. Okay, and even though here you would say, well, does this have anything to do with Passover? What's the connection? Okay, there is a Jewish tradition that interprets this verse, that it says twice here, in your blood is life, in your blood is life, that refers to two blood, the blood of circumcision and the blood of the Passover sacrifice, together are a sign of the covenant or of the connection between God and the Jewish people. So you can see that also played out there. And again, this is Jewish interpretation. You can reject it or not, but this is something that has become very fundamental to the way Jews see this whole picture when we're putting it together. Okay, now if we're continuing on in Exodus 12, after the beginning of it is talking about Passover in Egypt. The end of it is talking about how this will be forever in verse 24, and you will keep this thing, referring to the Passover sacrifice, as a rule for you and for your children forever. Okay, and in verses 26 and 27, we have a situation where you are going to be telling your sons, your children, the meaning of this Passover, and it's going to talk about how God passed over the nation of Israel when he struck the Egyptians and he saved the nation. So we have this whole idea of Passover being a sign, being something that we remember, that reminds us of how God saved us. Now, towards the end of chapter 12, we now have more specific laws about Passover that really are not just for the laws in Egypt, but the laws that continue. And this is very important in verse 43. These are the laws of the Pesach. No stranger shall eat it. Okay? Any servant of yours needs to be circumcised, and then he can eat it. And it goes on in verse 48. And if there is a stranger who lives around you and he wants to do the Passover for the God, he must be circumcised. Okay. And then finally, at the end of that verse, no uncircumcised person may eat the Passover sacrifice. So here, for the first time, we have an intimate connection between the need to circumcise and the ability to participate in the Passover sacrifice. And there's no question, if we're talking about the need to be circumcised, their need to be part of the nation, the need to, in a physical way, become a part of the covenant between God and the nation of Israel. And only once they become a part of the covenant are they able to participate in the Passover. Passover representing God, how God acted out on this covenant. God redeemed the nation of Israel from Egypt. He redeemed those people that have become part of the covenant, who were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and who physically took part in this making of the covenant by circumcising their children. And when we see that connection, of course, it makes perfect sense now. If we go back to the book of Joshua, it makes absolutely perfect sense that if they crossed the Jordan in the spring, they crossed the Jordan at the beginning of the month of Nisan, which is the first month of the year. If they crossed in that month, and on the 14th day of that month is Passover, then in order to be able to do the Passover, they are going to have to circumcise themselves. Otherwise, they won't be able to do the Passover. So there is clearly a technical connection here, okay? But I think the connection really is much more than technical, and that's what I would like to discuss a little bit here. First of all, I would point out a unique word that is used here and also in the story of Moses and his wife at the inn when Zipporah, his wife, circumcises their youngest child. In Joshua chapter 5, verse 2, we have God saying to Joshua, make flint knives, make knives of flint. And we know that, and that's exactly what Joshua does, and it's these knives of flint that they use to circumcise themselves. We know in Exodus 4 that Zipporah takes a flint, and is with this flint that she circumcises the baby. Now, it's very possible that flint is just a material that was known in the ancient world. If you're going to circumcise somebody, you did it with flint. Very possible. But on the other hand, I think it's very interesting that there is that connection, the mention of the flint in both cases. And if in the case of Zipporah, she's circumcising the child with a flint in order to enable the family to join the nation of Israel and begin the process of redemption. In this case, they are using that same flint to circumcise the nation in order to begin the process of conquering the land of Israel. And I think these are both very, very key events. If we're talking about the covenant between God and the Jewish people, the covenant is about the children. What was the original covenant, the original promise of God to Abraham? I will give this land to your children. And that becomes the basis of all the covenants between God and the people of Israel. That there will be a nation, that nation will be a nation dedicated to God. That's the relationship between God and the people of Israel, always tied up around the land of Israel. The nation of Israel is going into the land of Israel. If they observe the covenant, they will remain in the land of Israel. If they do not observe the covenant, they will be thrown out of the land of Israel. And so indeed, as they're coming into the land of Israel now, they have to do that circumcision as a way of cementing the covenant of each and every individual man and each and every individual family with God. Okay, because it is that covenant that needs to be the basis of the relationship of the land of Israel and the nation of Israel. Okay, God is basically saying in all the covenants, if you obey my covenant, you'll have the land. If you don't obey the covenant, you won't. So you have to enter into the covenant. Now, we will see later on in a few chapters, there will be an additional covenant ceremony between the nation and God. But before we get to that, every single individual has to enter into the individual covenant. And if you think about it, circumcision is not really an individual covenant. It's the individual membership in the general covenant, okay? In other words, when they all stand at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which we'll learn later on in chapter 8, they're going to all say, okay, amen, 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 and in a chorus. They're all going to be together. But here, every single individual has to enter into the covenant by putting this sign on their flesh. They have to circumcise themselves, and in this way, they enter into the covenant with God. Now, I would say, so basically, what we're looking at here is this element of circumcision that not only precedes Passover because it's a technical thing. Okay, it precedes Passover first of all because only those people who are part of the covenant can partake in the Passover. But the fact that they're doing these things as soon as they enter the land of Israel also says something, because God redeemed the nation of Israel from Egypt, which is, of course, what Passover is all about, in order to bring them into the land of Israel. And it's all part of this covenant. The covenant that begins with selecting the nation of Israel, where God says, my firstborn Israel. And then the covenant that as a result redeems the nation from Egypt and then brings them to the land of Israel, where they will have this harmonious covenant that connects the land of Israel, the people of Israel, with the God of Israel. Okay, so we have this all kind of coming together here in chapter 5 when they circumcise themselves and they then perform the Passover. I just want to add one more tiny thing, and that is about the stopping of the manna. Now, first of all, what you see by stopping the manna is that we're changing gears, okay? Until now, God provided the food for the nation in a miraculous way. As soon as they enter the land of Israel, they move from miracle to nature. They move from totally being dependent on God as they wander in the wilderness, which is a place that's very hard to sustain a nation. Without the miracle of the manna, it wouldn't have worked, okay? Now they come into the land and they're going to get down to the business of building a nation. They're going to start fighting wars. They're not going to sit back and they're going to start fighting wars. They're going to have to farm the land. They're going to have to produce food. And that happens right away. The manna stopped. And right afterwards, it says they ate from the yield of the land. And I think there's nothing like eating from what has been grown in the land, especially when this stuff that was grown in the land, they didn't grow. They are clearly taking from stuff that was grown in the land that was planted by somebody else. There is no greater expression of taking possession that a nation comes in and eats of the harvest of the land, that it becomes theirs. It's theirs. Nobody says they stole it, it says they ate it, okay? But they ate it because that harvest, that yield becomes theirs. And this is, again, they're going to start going to war. They're going to start actually conquering the cities. But in this initial thing, this tells us something about, this kind of introduces the whole thing. So I think basically what we're at here, we're at a turning point. Right after this, we're going to start talking about the battles of Jericho, etc. But right here, we talk about a cementing of the covenant with God. We talk about the individuals entering into that covenant, entering into the land of Israel, and of course, eating from the produce of the land, which is this idea of taking possession of the land and enjoying its fruits. And I'll just add one more thing. There's a custom to this day that on the first Sabbath after Passover, when you bake your challah, your special, braided challah for Shabbat, you put a little key. And people just take a key and they bake it into the challah, or some people will bake a challah in the shape of a key. And the source of this custom is right here, okay? The key represents the entrance to the land of Israel. We were given the key to the land. And how did that happen? Because we ate of the harvest. We ate of the wheat of the land. When? Right after Passover. So every year, right after Passover, we remember this as we bake our first bread after Passover. We remember that this was the time that we entered the land, that we were given the key to the land. That's my message for today. Any comments? Love to hear them.
Sondra, I had something to say about the flint. As you know, the Native Americans used flint to produce arrowheads, right. And it can be shaved off and it's crystalline, so it's very sharp and very hard, and you can make a point and a sharp edge with it. So I think it was common around the world.
I'm sure it was, but usually, the scripture doesn't tell us the materials. They'll say they took a sword, they did something, or they would just say they circumcised. But the very fact that they mention the material in both places, it just says to me, I have to pay attention. But I agree with you. There's no question. I'm sure it was the usual kind of material that was used. Question is, why was it mentioned?
Mm-hmm. I see.
Any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, it was great to see you. And we will hopefully meet again next week. Next week is already Hanukkah, okay? But we're going to be meeting anyway, okay? See you all. Have a great day and a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.